So it is my pleasure to introduce my guest tonight, who is Robert Ricigliano, who is currently the director of the Institute of World Affairs and teaches at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. But he's also the former executive director of the Conflict Management Group, which is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and served as the associate director of the Harvard Negotiation Project at Harvard Law School for years. And he has worked extensively on the ground around the world with government officials and armed groups and community activists in trying to build peace. And I asked Robert to join me here. He's actually in town for a couple of days to work on the development of a new institute that we're working on in applying complex systems thinking to peace-building processes. But he's the author of a new book, which is called Making Peace Last, a Toolbox for Sustainable Peace-Building. And it's, to some degree, a provocative book because it suggests that how peace builders, which could be diplomats, could be government officials, could be NGOs and activists, but peace builders around the world, typically how they are working is to some degree obsolete. It's I would say piecemeal, right? So there are many activists and many government officials around the world working in different ways, but oftentimes not having a sense of how others are working and not coordinating effectively. So Robin, in his new book, is proposing an alternative paradigm, an alternative way to think and work with this. And so I've asked him to come and speak a little bit about the book. So perhaps you can just start by giving us a sense of why the heck would you spend 2 years of your life writing a book like this?
Thanks, Peter. I think one is you seem to have gotten it great to a T. I mean, that's basically the premise of the book and the argument of the book. I think the reason why I wrote it, in the spirit of systems thinking and complexity, which often say seemingly unrelated events are actually very much related. So maybe it comes down to children and plumbing fixtures. So the children aspect of this was I came to the University of Wisconsin, moved from Boston to Wisconsin after our third child was born. And my wife and I decided we couldn't do 3 kids in a city that we didn't have any family in, so we moved to where my wife's family is from. That brought me to the university, and it was going to the university that allowed me the time and the space to really start to think about what I had been doing as a practitioner for many years. And there were 3 questions that I thought about. One was, why did what we do work when it worked? Because we had successes, and we could point to those and learn from them. Why did we do not work when it didn't work? Because we had failures and things that did not go, maybe not failures, but things that went less optimally, I mean, we might say. And then the third question, which was the most important, was why, even when what we did work, it didn't work. So, in other words, things that we did in sort of the mediation, dialogue, negotiation field and the process, where we actually help combatant parties reach agreements on things. But in the context of conflicts that over the course of a decade or more hadn't really changed all that much. Mm-hmm. I mean, the events were different and maybe the people were different and some of the conditions were different, but the overall sense that this society has fundamentally shifted from a unstable, unjust situation of violence to a just, sustainable, prosperous, no, those hadn't happened.
You mentioned in the book that you worked a bit with the conflict in Colombia.
Yeah,
maybe you could just elaborate on that.
So a colleague of mine and I, when I was at Conflict Management Group, we were asked to come in and work with then President Andres Pastrana and his High Commissioner for Peace, and we had very good access, at least to the governmental side. And we were helping with them with all kinds of things, met with them very often. And there was one particular negotiation where the president was going down to the demilitarized zone, to the Despeje, to meet with the head of the FARC guerrillas. And it was a very critical time. If this negotiation failed, it was likely war was going to resume. So we sent down a memo that had a list of ways in which the president could keep the peace process going, things that they could agree to, ways to keep this going. We got a call back. They reached agreement in this big summit. I got a call back a couple weeks later from one of the president's assistants, and she said, I just want to let you know that some of the paragraphs in your memo made it into the peace agreement. And as a mediator, as sort of throwing in sort of third-party advice, that's pretty good success. Like we said X, and it ended up in the peace agreement.
Right.
And that's great. And then, thinking about that now, almost 10 years on, in that case, almost more than 12 years on, Colombia has changed, but it fundamentally is not in a different place than where we were back in 2000.
Sure.
So why? Like that was a pretty stark one where we could say, hey, this is a success in the confines of my discipline,
mm-hmm.
but it is not a success in the big picture. So why is that?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that? And then sort of certain things, I sort of feel like I know I'm not the smartest person in the world, but after getting hit on the head so many times with something, you start to realize.
Mm-hmm.
And I can think of other things that were successful, and that were different though. So I sort of pair that Colombia experience with the experience we had in Georgia, in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, working with the government of then President Shevardnadze and the leadership of the breakaway enclave of South Ossetia, and we again back channel dialogue process, work with both sides. The Norwegian government was involved in supporting this, and we actually made a good bit of progress in that. And they in our informal channel, they reached agreements between these representatives of both sides. They then took them into the formal channels, or they did separate but parallel action that advanced the situation, brought rehabilitated villages, brought settlers back, eased tension. At the beginning of the process, an Ossetian could not go into Georgia, and vice versa. Now people were meeting all the time in both capitals. So there were lots of really fundamental signs of improvement. Things retrenched a bit in recent years with the Russian involvement, but in the 5 years that we were involved, and in the years after that, it did fundamentally change. And one of the things that really changed about it was, and again, this was sort of like, how obvious do I have to make it for you before you learn,
Sure.
Was our partner in that was the Norwegian Refugee Council.
Uh-huh.
So when we helped facilitate a negotiation amongst the parties, and they talked about rehabilitating these border villages, bringing Ossets back or Georgians back to these villages, that was going to require a lot of work, relief development type work that we as a negotiation organization didn't do.
Mm-hmm.
In the past, what we would have said is, great agreement, patted them on the back and say, now, good luck to you.
Right.
But now our partners could pick it up and say, well, let us work with you and give you advice on how to resettle those villages, how to finance this, the technical support, the logistical support. And those things actually happened. And when they resettled the villages, the next time we brought them together, I never forget this. At the end of our, I think it was our third round, one of the Ossetian leaders, we said at the end of the session, what stood out for you in this session? And he said, he looked at his Georgian colleagues and he said, I finally trust you.
Mm.
I didn't before, but I do now.
Mm-hmm.
We kept thinking, wow, it took you this long.
Right.
But what built the trust was talk into action, led to sort of attitudinal change. That's the trust, back into talk,
Mm-hmm.
back into action. And there was something about that cycle we went through repeatedly. So it was this, unlike Ghostbusters, we were not supposed to cross the streams. We crossed the streams. We
Right.
brought the negotiation people and the relief development people together with the political people, and got some tangible things done that helped both.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one was it was iterative. We didn't solve the whole thing in one go.
Right.
I mean, it was something that built up slowly over time, and all those lessons kind of combined to say, hey, maybe there's a different recipe
Sure.
we need to be following here.
So let's follow that thread. What is a different recipe? I mean, so I hear some components of it, as you say, that the better coordination between different elements, negotiation, politics, humanitarian relief, and perhaps development. But so what does that look like? Provide for us just a clear distinction between how this work is usually done and how it's different when it works.
So, I mean, typical would be if we take an agency like the U.S. Agency for International Development, they're really born of technical expertise.
Mm-hmm.
So people we have public health people, we have agronomists, we have some people with a human rights background, let's say. You've got people who have traditional economic development or rural livelihood development type backgrounds, right? So we have lots of technical expertise. The way they would operate would be to they would all have different, they'd be organized into different bureaus and different work teams. Mm-hmm. When they went into if they look at a particular country, it would, the public health people would be thinking about how do we do public health here? The education people would be how do we do education? The environmental remediation people would be saying how do we do environmental protection or resource management? And it was, so initially it was like take a very complex system, society, and split it up into manageable pieces. Mm-hmm. And then we sort of manage each piece. Right. And the problem is that, it's a little bit like, the assumption is it's like maybe repairing a broken car engine, where mm-hmm. we can take it apart. We can say, hey, the spark plugs are bad, mm-hmm. or the rotor's bad, or the timing belt's bad. And we place those things, put it back together, and the engine works. Mm-hmm. And we sort of think that a society like Colombia or Haiti or Cambodia or Afghanistan is the same way. Mm-hmm. And we just have to split it up into little pieces, fix the little pieces, and then it all goes back together. And it's really not. Those societies are so dynamic and interconnected that you really can't isolate pieces. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the one of the big challenges is we have this mindset where we want to take complexity. It's overwhelming. I can't deal with it all. So I'm going to find the piece I can deal with, mm-hmm. deal with that piece, and then hope that better piece is going to do its part of a bigger system. And of course, other people are fixing other pieces that are broken, but that's not my responsibility. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But we sort of have to, the shift is we have to, what I saw in sort of the Georgian work and other work was, as we began to get work across sectors, look bigger picture, the better. And then the systems, when I got more and more into sort of looking at systems thinking, it basically said, well, it's not just add one more sector. It's not like 2 sectors are better than 1, 3 is better than 2. Really, we have to get a sense of the whole as the whole, because the whole tells us something different than each of the pieces do. Mm-hmm. And that's the big shift is seeing wholes. And then once you start to see wholes, you've got to, you can't see everything in equal depth, so you have to start to see patterns. Mm-hmm. And you have to see dynamics. And mm-hmm. so instead of focusing on individual social phenomena, violence, human rights abuses, rural poverty, we have to see patterns of behavior over time. So why is it that rural poverty persists over time? Why is it that we have regular recurrent cycles of violence? And why is it the fact that they're happening together, does that mean something? Mm-hmm. Is there a relationship? So it's a very different way, as a friend of mine would say, it's a different theory of the environment. Mm-hmm. A different theory about how the world works.
What I hear you generally saying is that it's useful to have a picture of the whole, the system, and the relationship between the different elements as you work with it. One of the criticisms of that approach is that Afghanistan is way too complex to really have any kind of accurate sense of what's going on. I remember a notorious PowerPoint slide that was published in the New York Times about 2 or 3 years ago.
The article was, we have met the enemy, and it is PowerPoint.
Exactly. And it presented a slide which apparently is representative of slides that the U.S. military creates every day, which I think was a slide depicting how their strategy for increasing the popularity of the Afghani government works. And it had all these different components, and reportedly General Petraeus, when he first, it was McChrystal, I think, first entered the theater there, looked at this slide and said, when we understand this, we'll have made peace, because it makes no sense to me, because it's way too complex.
Yeah.
So they seem to get it. They seem to understand that you need to kind of know how all the pieces affect each other, or at least have some image of that. But then what? How do you work with that?
I doing some work actually with the Department of Defense on planning about a year ago, and in talking to them about how to get this view, because the temptation was, the current one is drill down and get a really, really deep sense of a very small piece. And then people say, no, you really have to understand the big thing. But they want to get a detailed, same drill down. Now they want, instead of 1, they want 100. And the human brain can't handle that. So there are certain parameters I think this view has to fulfill. One of them is to be comprehensive, right? That's the big slide with all the arrows and the circles and words and all that stuff. But it also has to be comprehensible. And so they tend to work against each other. So to be comprehensive, we tend to lose comprehensibility. It's way too complicated. This is McChrystal's comment. Or in order to make it comprehensible, we cut out comprehensiveness. So we just sort of block out big charts of the parts of the scenario and just focus on something small. You have to balance the two. And what's interesting is that I think that is what the focus of systems thinking on understanding dynamics, these represented as feedback loops, is a really good discipline, because what it does is it makes you choose. You can't have equal depth, but you also need breadth, and it balances breadth and depth in a way that you get a good comprehensive view, but it's still understandable. It's still comprehensible, and that's, I think, the trick to this, and what sort of the discipline of the tool helps. So it fundamentally changes how you think about the situation. So I am sacrificing some depth, and in favor of getting this breadth. But the idea is, before I decide what it is I should do, I need to have the broad view,
context,
sufficiently deep, right? So so I've that view of the overall context. Once I've got that, then I can decide where I want to drill down, and I can actually gather lots more information. I need to gather lots more information. But I think that's also one of the sort of mindset changes is that we have to balance breadth and depth. We have to be comprehensive and comprehensible at the same time, and that takes a discipline, a thinking discipline, both in creating these systems maps, but also processing them. What do we learn from them? What do we take away from them? And how do we use them to guide our action?
Right. So just to be clear, the approach is not mechanical, right? The approach is not one where you take a engine or take a machine and break it apart and put it back together. The approach is different. So what is a different image that would help capture that?
So I'll give you two. So one is the analogy I use a lot is to say, if you've got a patient who comes into a doctor and says, I've got a series of maladies here. We're not really sure what's causing them. First thing, the doctor's not going to say, look, I'm a podiatrist, so let me work on your feet. And you say, well, I don't really have a problem with my feet. But they say, well, I don't care. I'm really good at feet. So what you'd really hope for, and I think what you do see is in very complex situations, I write about in the book about my experience of when my father had a stroke and working with it, being in the intensive care unit and watching this team of many different doctors, nurses, and so on, working on him, really literally day by day, hour by hour, to save his life. What they did is they worked from a picture of him in total, and they did this battery of diagnostic tests. It's almost like if you could do a super MRI of a whole body, and that would tell you, oh, he's got these arteries are blocked. He's got this damage, to his spinal column. He's got high blood pressure, whatever it is. So if you do this sort of super MRI of the body and get that image, and you sort of see that there are all these different discrete maladies, but more importantly, I have to understand how they are interrelated. And so maybe I don't want to go after the kidney, the deteriorated kidney first. Maybe I have to manage the blood pressure issue first, or open the arteries first. And that only happens if you have the picture of the whole, and then you can drill in. The other image I would give, I was talking to a colleague at the U.S. Agency for International Development last week, and we were sort of lamenting that development projects are thought of more of like mechanical engineering projects, like building a bridge. And the image came to us of why is development in Haiti treated more like building a bridge than curing cancer. So it's not really a pictorial image, but the idea being, at building a bridge, we kind of know once we've measured the soil quality and the river flow and everything, we know how to engineer that bridge and build that bridge. Haiti is not really like that. I mean, Haiti is more like curing cancer, where we don't really have an idea. We do research. We really focus on whatever it is, whatever intervention we make. It's primarily to help cure the patient, but it's probably more about understanding the condition. What is the pathology here? How do we understand how it works?
Sure.
And so that's the sort of somewhat different image. Is that sort of the approach is less like the mechanical engineering project than it is about the sort of curing cancer.
Right. Working with the living system.
Yeah,
right.
exactly. Understanding that living system and how to work with that living system. And you may never cure that cancer, but you want to at least transition the patient from being on a deteriorating march to death to a stable, quality of life that's improving.
So that makes perfect sense. It's clear, and I get the need for a more holistic approach, a more holistic view. If I do just human rights work, how does that interconnect with development and other types of work? Why don't we do that? Why does the United Nations? Why do NGOs? Why do state departments around the world not take that approach?
So, I can also refer. This is a very common issue, and I also last year I was working with USAID on using systems thinking tools more in their practice, particularly in their conflict assessment work, and we quickly had to sort of say to them, you really have two problems here. So you want to use these systems tools so that you can better understand what I call the complexity out there. So a systems map, say, of Cambodia will give you, I think, a qualitatively better view of Cambodia, like the super MRI of a patient, in order for you to do your programming better. I said, but there's also the problem of the complexity in here. In other words, the organizations themselves are complex systems. They exist the way they exist. They do what they do, not because it's random, but because it serves a purpose. So in a place like USAID, and this is true of most organizations, they're set up with a level of incentives that make it hard to take a complexity or systems approach. So one of the things I talk about with folks, almost to get a laugh out of them in these organizations, I say one of the hallmarks of a good systems practice is to be what's called error embracing. That we have to not just think, celebrate the success, but also learn from the failures and the errors. And I said, how many of you would say that USAID or any of these other organizations, UN, are error embracing? And people just laugh, and they say, well, of course not. That error embracing is a career limiting move, or if you're a grantee, it's a grant limiting move. You're not going to get another grant.
It feels very non-human too. I mean, psychologically, we avoid error, we deny our error, we ignore it. Yeah.
And it's part of the wanting to feel you want to maximize control of the situation. It gives people comfort and makes them feel that they can be effective. So there's some of these deeper psychological sort of drivers of this. There's also sort of more transient kind of organizational practices. How donor organizations give money out. They let big contracts out, and they're because they have to account to a Congress or a Parliament for how they spent that money. They break it down into very specific line items. You will, train X number of people or whatever.
Measurables.
Yeah. CLINs, and we used to be called at one point client line item numbers.
Right.
And you had to report on all these things multiple times. And the problem is that keeps you from being adaptive, from learning. So if we learn something early on that says, hey, that preset objective really isn't appropriate or could even be counterproductive, good luck. You're still going to be dinged for not doing it if you don't do it.
Sure.
So it's that complexity in here. We're set up that way for a reason, and it's not because people are malintentioned or incompetent. It's not that at all. It's that the paradigm, as you referred to earlier, sets us up in a way to try to do these very human things, which are maximize control, increase certainty. Allow ourselves to sort of plan in a linear kind of A then B then C kind of way. But as it turns out, that theory of the environment, that theory of action, is really not appropriate for the kind of complex systems that we're trying to work with.
So it almost seems it's the rigidity, perhaps, of the organizations. I think of a metaphor is, I remember when I started to teach at the UN, and I would be given a room to teach in, Well, in the UN, many of the rooms have chairs that are in a certain order and are nailed to the floor.
Yeah.
Right? And so to teach a course where you move people around and do
Right.
small group work, you can't do it.
You can't do it.
You can
Yeah.
only do
Yeah.
what the
Yeah.
UN was
Right.
literally built to do,
Right.
right?
Right.
So part of it is the rigidity.
It's exactly that. It's exactly that.
Okay, so best case scenario. You've written this book. You've been doing this work. I know you work with a lot of colleagues in different areas who are seeing the value of thinking about things holistically, of working with better coordination and better communication. Best case scenario, what would you like to see happen in the world of either international affairs or peace building? How would you like to see this have an impact?
That's it's a good question. It's a difficult question, and you know, as I was writing the book, I was realizing that you know, I have to take my own advice. You know, I recount the next story in the book about I was working with. There was a task force on reinventing government during the Clinton administration, and I was worked very briefly with them on doing one of the consultation sessions. They were very big on doing these consultation sessions, and they had they had a series of commandments for the regulators to follow. So it would be like, get out of Washington, you know, to get to know the people you're working with. And one of the dictates was, don't dictate, negotiate. And I said, I love that. I love the sentiment there because I do negotiation work. On the other hand, you can't become better at negotiating by dictating because it's sort of, you can't dictate to be a good negotiator. Right. And the same with this is that you can't tell people in a complex system, change on a dime. So part of one of the big changes is we have to change our definition, I think, of what success is or how we measure success. So if you look at, as I talk in the book, sort of a peace-building system, which is governments and, you know, donor governments and host governments and civil society organizations and beneficiary populations, they're all part of a big system. And so that's going to take a long time, I think, to really change and evolve that system. So what I'm hoping is, it doesn't mean that we can't have expectations, though. So what I'm hoping is that there are pockets of change happening in very complex bureaucracies like the U.S. government, where people are starting to sort of make that change. They're starting to say, hey, you know, maybe it's our theory of the environment that's wrong. It's not just the programs we run. And some of that is in the area of doing assessment work, planning work, and in some ways what's known as M&E or monitoring and evaluation. And so each of those communities, people are starting to say, hey, you know, in the monitoring and evaluation community, it's really not just about the impacts, the short-term impacts of a program. It's about the long-term impacts in the sort of surrounding ecosystem. So how do we measure the ripple effects of a program, not just the immediate impacts of the program?
Second and third order effects.
Second and third order effects.
Yeah.
How do we articulate them? How do we measure them, and so on? And I think I think that there are, you know, it's in these areas where it's supporting the change that's happening in these areas that is beginning to change people's awareness of themselves as a system. And I think that's the first step to them saying, well, now we can begin to grapple with the system as a system. Those incentives, those structures that may or may not be serving us well. And until people are aware of them, they're not going to change. So I do think it's going to be a longer term process. I am encouraged by the people that I talk with, you know, week to week, month to month, in various parts of the bureaucracy in different parts of the world who are getting this. So I think we have to kind of break it down. We have to break down what we see as success and what are sort of important indicators that change is happening. So I think it's about how it starts with, I think, the thinking process, how people in these organizations start to think about how they do what they do, how they measure their success, how they engage with these environments. And I think we are seeing some signs there. So I think as long as I'm somewhat satisfied that people haven't sort of walked away from this sort of movement, and I think the contrary is true. I think it's a movement that is actually growing day by day.
My guest is Robert Ricigliano. He is the director of the Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and he is the author of a new book called Making Peace Last, a Toolbox for Sustainable Peace Building. It is published by Paradigm Press, and I believe it's probably available on Amazon.
Yeah, and you can also like us on Facebook, Making Peace Last, and there's a website, makingpeacelast.com.
Very good. So check that out. I must say I find the book to be a fascinating read and a very practical read for those who are involved in this type of work or who are interested in becoming involved in this type of work. I think this is an important contribution. So thank you very much for
Thanks,
your
Peter.
time and for your work.
I really enjoyed it.